Hey everyone, super excited to be here and meet you all or re-meet you as it may be. Today I'm going to talk about a sort of broad research agenda, how we can have a new grand data bargain for public interest AI. To start the talk off, what I like to do on the morning of this kind of talk is I just go on the local news and I search for something relevant. So here's generative AI. This talk is going to be in part about generative AI, but it's also not about generative AI. It's more broadly about all data-dependent computing systems. But we can see there's a lot going on. There's a lot of discussions. This is the Globe and Mail. It's very similar if you go look at New York Times or LA Times or something like that. A lot of concerns and also, but a lot of sort of promise and opportunity and this what seems like a new potential for things to go well. In particular, let's start with the societal concern side or the harm side. Two particular things that folks have discussed in quite a bit of depth now. One is that this new wave of generative AI seems like it's very good at helping adversarial actors spend very small amounts of money to produce deceptive or harmful content. This could lead to broad manipulation. It could lead to basically targeting individuals. And there's a really serious concern that we're going to see and are seeing now, degradation of digital infrastructures. In some cases on a platform like Facebook, this might mean a bunch of new activity, but it's all spam. And then on another platform like Stack Overflow, perhaps all the users aren't going anymore because the people who might have gone to Stack Overflow and contributed to that community are going to ChatGPT instead. So that's one issue. Sort of related and also very kind of looming issue is economic disruption and the associated deep destabilization that comes when that happens. So there's already sort of anecdotes, and we're starting to see data about job loss in domains like translation, visual art, but we can expect probably to see a lot more as well. Many companies are claiming that AI is the explanation for layoffs. Of course, I mean, this is always, the causality is a little bit questionable there when a company puts out a press release and says, here's why we're doing layoffs. We can't really take that at face value, but it seems like there's more coming. And then also I should just point out, these are just a few, there's a kind of a wide swath of really important research on the harms of AI and computing broadly. But these are the two that I think are going to be most relevant to the research I'll talk about today. So what do we do about it? Pathways to redress. What could we do? So one obvious thing that's going to happen regardless, and the question is how effective it's going to be, is regulation. Potentially, we could see internal collective action by tech workers, and this has happened and is continuing to sort of see organizing efforts, or traditional consumer boycotts, perhaps, right? All three of these things are actions that society could take to limit some of these harms. But today I'm going to argue for actually an additional route that takes advantage of what I see as a natural dependency of these AI systems, which is data flow. And my sort of argument is that the public can use its role as a key upstream source of knowledge, of insights, of sort of human values, to gain bargaining power and steer the ship of upcoming AI systems. So why data flow? Why focus on this? I just want to make this really clear. I'm not against regulation or tech worker collective action or consumer action. I think this is not an either or. All these avenues are and should be complementary. But data flow is of interest to me because I really see it as a natural dependency. It's something that is very inherent in the way the technology is built. And also, it's very exciting because there's a potential to align with the incentives of techcos and governments. So if you're trying to push for a lot of AI and computing-related regulation, you sort of have to fight an uphill battle against tech company lobbyists, against potentially people in my community, sort of computing technologists who are want to advance the technology sort of regardless of the costs. But the data flow stuff, actually, Microsoft probably wants this. Google probably wants this. The BC government probably wants this. So this is really promising. And ultimately, I hope to convince you that this can lead to a very democratic approach to balancing pros and cons of innovation. Okay, so the line of argument here goes like this. The most upstream dependency of any AI system, and I'm going to use AI here to sort of broadly refer to data-dependent computing systems. You can, if you've been thinking about LLMs lately, you can sort of insert LLM into almost all of these slides and it will make sense. But if you don't like LLMs, you could also think about things like recommender systems, search engines, targeted advertising, information retrieval, et cetera. So the argument that sort of my colleagues and I have been building on and trying to make for a while now is that we are all data laborers. We all sort of are providing this upstream dependency data labor, even though our data labor activities are quite variable. So, some of us might know that we are doing data labor, others might not. Some of us might know how a particular piece of data is being used in a large language model, for instance. Some of us might not. Sometimes sort of our data labor, our production of content and knowledge and insights and values is collaborative. Sometimes it's more siloed and individualistic, et cetera, and so on. And then this last one is really important, is that sometimes our data labor is also our actual labor. So if you're a scholar and you have a mandate from your boss, which is to make sure to publish some papers and make them open access, it can be really hard to not have those documents that you put on the internet flow downstream to a large language model, even if you personally are very upset with the technology companies and you don't want to be doing that. It's quite hard to avoid that. Okay, so if you want to read more about sort of these dimensions, this is a pretty recent paper that really goes into a lot of depth about that. So the core argument of the talk is that I want to convince you again that sort of by supporting a new data bargain, a healthy market, if you want to call it a market or an ecosystem, I think it's a bit of both. If we can sort of create healthy data supply chains, which means leverage for data labor, so bargaining power, that will help us to create AI that benefits everyone in society. And it's nice because this particular avenue towards that is something that some of the tech companies want. Some of them don't want it, to be clear. There's certain, I'm not going to claim that everybody is going to be super duper happy about all of the things that I described here, but certainly some do want it. And then also, this is a three circle Venn diagram where it's good for society. Some of the tech companies want it, and probably the vast majority of data laborers also want these sort of healthy, good bargain data supply chains. So the current bargain is implicit. It's sort of unwritten, and it's typically not so great for data laborers. So there is a grand bargain right now, which is more or less that everything that you put online and everything that you do mediated by a technology company's product will be used to train AI, whether you like it or not. And so if we can change that, if we can sort of give more people more power to reconfigure their data flows to select which sort of applications or organizations they want data to flow to, that can be one piece of building more democratic governance of AI. Okay. I'm also, so I think we're going to have a Q&A session at the end, but I'm also very happy to take questions as we go. I should have said that at the beginning, so feel free to interrupt if you like. I'm totally open to that. Okay, so a little bit of background on this, this idea of content supply chains or data supply chains. So it's a niche area of research, and it predates LLMs by quite a bit, actually. So there's an ongoing terminological battle / co-creation thing going on right now. Some of the terms that I'll use here, you might hear things like content ecosystems. This is sort of more of an industry side way to describe how you get content and documents and tokens from the language model. Data leverage is the idea that the data creators might actually exert leverage via their data flow. Data labor is sort of the upstream activities that create the knowledge, the insights, and the values. And then I'll also talk about data strikes and conscious data contribution a little bit. These are things that my earlier research really focuses heavily on as specific collective action campaigns that people might use to gain that bargaining power. Okay, so basically right now, a lot of these LLMs, but also again, if you don't like LLMs and you want to sort of in your head switch this out for recommendation systems or search engines, it is equally valid, sort of rely on two grand bargains. So on the left-hand side, we have sort of these very traditional bargains where tech companies pay for their GPUs and their computing data centers and their energy. And there's lots of sort of problems and things to interrogate on this side for sure. But for the sake of the talk, I'm going to skip it and just note that this is very traditional, and it's mostly just sort of businesses doing business things. There's markets, the prices sort of adjust based on supply and demand, and everyone who's involved in this side, the traditional bargain side, is going in sort of with a relatively equal amount of information. On the right side, that's not so true. This is a very unconventional bargain that's really based on information asymmetry. And this idea of non-compete. So we put all of our literature and our code and our documents, and we edit Wikipedia, and we go on social media. And sort of if you were doing all of these things in 2019, you would have the assumption that a tech company is not going to come along, vacuum up all these things you put on the internet, and then create a digital, clone of you that's going to compete and take away your job. That was the assumption. But it's sort of foreshadowing a little bit, it seems like that assumption is starting to fray at the edges a little bit. And so this unconventional bargain, probably we want to change it. We want a new one. So there's this kind of this question of who's a content producer or who is in that unconventional bargain. Right now in the news and in a lot of these discussions in the responsible AI spaces, it's sort of journalists, artists, coders, journalists in particular. You may have seen that the New York Times is suing OpenAI with some pretty large demands, including that all GPT models should be deleted because they have copyrighted content. So potentially big implications of that. But journalists, artists, coders, they're the center of attention right now. These are sort of the kinds of content and data that are being centered in the LLM discussions. But really, what I would say is that it's almost everyone who currently uses the internet or will ever use the internet is implicated in this bargain. So we sort of stand at the precipice of trying to decide on a new collective agreement for everyone in the world. It's really high stakes, I think. And again, yeah, so this is two grand bargains that don't just make LLMs possible, but sort of all of AI and computing broadly. And actually, so this is a slide from 2017 that was basically making the same exact argument, but with some more old school images. And we could think about GPS traces, carrying your phone around and using Google Maps, or sort of Google is taking measurements of how crowded your bus is when you're on it. Query reformulation, so just the fact that you go in and you type in one query and then you change it. All of your clicks, all of the reviews that you've ever put on Yelp or Google Maps or Goodreads. If you've ever edited Wikipedia, if you've participated in forums and discussion boards and social media, all these things have been sort of fueling computing and AI broadly, since 2017, but also before 2017. So in grad school, my lab's research was very sort of curious about what a new grand bargain might look like. So here's just sort of some various papers. The reason why I guess we were excited about this is that we thought that AI might continue to see progress, and I think we were right about that. And that means that the information asymmetry and the non-compete that sort of made the old bargain, not the best bargain, but not the worst bargain either, right? Those are going to go away. So we now have a big problem where we're seeing underpowered AI systems because people are now have these strong incentives to not contribute data because they're being competed with, because they're starting to realize what's happening. Now there's sort of a growing community of people who are looking into this and are sort of broadly interested in that. I personally am very grateful for sort of both academic and also non-academic communities who've supported a lot of this work. So I think it's also just interesting to note that sort of the early efforts to talk about this work to broad audiences would often see kind of emotional and engaged reaction, especially on the tech side. People don't like some of this narrative, sort of arguing that by doing computer science, you're exploiting people or using their data labor in a way that they don't want. It feels bad. But I think that reframing this as a bargain that we're all participating in can alleviate a lot about that. So like one of the early ways that we would talk about this is we'd sort of have these little images and say like, you might not realize it, but you have a Google employee card too. We're all sort of working for moonlighting for Google in some sense. Don't tell the provost, but you all have second jobs for tech companies. So this is sort of the old way that we would do this, and I think it still applies actually. Okay, so now, if we look at 2022, which, oh my goodness, that's 2 years ago now, but it seems recent, time flies in this space. Sort of ChatGPT, GitHub Copilot, now Google has one, now Facebook has one, etc. These have gotten a lot of news coverage. People know about this and people are thinking about AI now. And then there's sort of this, again, to repeat myself a little bit, this non-compete notion, the idea that these AI systems are not going to try to take your job, seems to be not so true anymore. And it's sort of the promise of LLMs is that they're going to add a lot of value in knowledge work domains. But those are the domains that are sort of, people might have thought before that they're not going to face threat from automation. And it seems like that's not so true. So we need a new grand bargain for content producers, i.e. everybody who uses the internet. We stand at this tremendous moment of uncertainty. What's going to happen? So I want to talk a little bit now about this incentive point again, and then ultimately, sort of the point of this talk is to argue that I think the research community in particular stands to overuse the word leverage a little bit. We have a potential leverage point coming where research and sort of academic research in particular can really start to set some norms around these topics in a way that might create a compounding effect with a new grand bargain. So just to comment briefly on sort of the industry and the machine learning academia perspective on these things, I think pragmatically, it's really important to think about the incentives of these two interconnected key actors, of course, because there's a revolving door in the tech industry, in the sort of the research labs, Google, Facebook, Amazon, et cetera, and academics in the machine learning space, right? I'm implicating myself here too. This is I personally try to keep a foot in both doors and keep connected to folks in industry, and that's certainly you would be lying if you were to say that doesn't change your incentives in some fashion. So why would these folks who are sort of broadly in ML academia / industry care? So data flow matters a lot for product quality. So there is a promise here that folks doing quote unquote core ML research team in industry or academia want to just make better AI products. And to do that, having more data flow and sort of more secure data supply chains is how the industry folks might talk about it. That matters a lot. ML researchers in any organization want high quality data. They don't necessarily want to pay for it. If they have to pay, sort of very high wages to all of the people who produce that data, that might make some projects impossible. So they want to get as much free high quality data as they can still. But ultimately, there is this incentive alignment there, which is really nice. Also, this is more so an issue for industry than academics, but the idea of having healthy or ethical or fair data supply chains matter a lot for companies with AI products that are selling them to especially other business customers. So Google, Meta, Microsoft, OpenAI, they don't want to have a bunch of headlines saying, my AI is built on unfair labor practices, or my AI is built on the theft of content. That's going to hurt their ability to sell their products to other businesses. So there's a win-win here that if academics, ourselves, can promote these new tools, policies, or norms around quote unquote healthy or fair data supply chains, this is very aligned with tech co-incentives. And then, of course, the legal developments may ramp this concern up further, right? So if all of a sudden all these companies have to delete all of their language models because of a lawsuit, now we really need any sort of tools, policies, or norms are suddenly ultra valuable in terms of sort of setting the stage for the future there. So one key concept that can make all of this possible, and that is probably looming more so in the minds of the tech industry now, is this idea of a data strike. So a data strike, we've sort of defined it as it occurs when a significant proportion of content producers for a given domain basically stop producing that content to try to force a change in behavior by the system owner. So it's a labor strike for data labor in particular. And it's always been something that could happen, but wasn't taken very seriously because of the previous bargain. Again, the information asymmetry, the implicit non-compete, they're gone now. And so actually, we're already starting to see a lot of collective action in the space of visual art in particular, where folks are taking various actions that's specifically designed to reduce the value that their content might provide to AI systems. And so even back in 2019, we did some research sort of simulating these using a variety of models. This is in the recommender system domain, so movie recommendation actually. And the results suggest that if you get 40% of the users to engage in the data strike, that sets you back 20 years of research in terms of sort of the performance levels of the machine learning system. I mean, this really speaks to the fact that all the sort of maths and computer science and theoretical research in the world is rendered useless in the face of not having data, not having sort of the collective participation from everyone else in the world. And so there's actually some work now. This was, of course, I should mention, this is sort of like a small research data set that's really popular with academics doing these sort of smaller, can I build an academic scale movie recommender, right? And you might have the question of, well, what does this have to tell us about large language models, right? These are a whole nother scale, many orders of magnitude of difference. But actually there's some work in the LLM space that's sort of this idea of having siloed language models where you have a big pre-training set that's all public domain, open, or sort of fairly licensed content. And then you have a data store over here with all of your copyrighted or protected content. And this actually makes it very possible to start testing things like what happens if we get rid of Wikipedia out of our language model? What happens if we get rid of all these books theory by the so book corpus is a data set that I've studied a bit myself and have some published work on. It's basically sort of just a scrape of books by authors that didn't realize they were doing that. And then books theory is also just basically a big scrape of books that's a bit controversial and has caused some significant discussion among the ML community about the ethics of using these data sets. And so this suggests that, in fact, data strikes, especially along professional domains, so all of the journalists, all of the authors, all of the poets, et cetera, potentially wield a lot of leverage to affect large language models if they were to band together via collective action. So it seems like we're sort of entering the data strike era. Journalists are starting to do this. Even the New York Times is covering various sort of data revolts breaking out against AI. And so, it remains to be seen. We're going to have to sort of watch how companies and academics respond to this, but it certainly seems like this is happening now. So in the context of LLMs, you could imagine low effort data strikes, people just updating their robots.txt to say, don't script me. You can do IP blocking. This is, very quick if you're a web admin. Of course, it's not necessarily accessible to like every user in the world, so maybe we need to do some more work there. You could imagine companies starting to put their content behind paywalls, and that's happening as well. And then the highest effort version of this is actual work stoppages that basically look like traditional labor strikes, but they're specifically focused on AI. And sort of a key idea that we see in the research is that these strikes have to be done collectively, and there's sort of I think everyone intuitively gets this idea that me by myself, Facebook and Google and Microsoft don't care about my personal one-person set of data points and content, and so it has to be a group acting together in order to actually gain any leverage. And then, of course, the highest effort version of this is that some organizations might legitimately go out of business, and then that means the data is dried up. So this is where maybe a market analogy is less useful than an ecological analogy, where LLM companies and sort of the bad data bargain basically causes this ecological collapse of like the content ecology. So are they guaranteed? I mean, we'll have to see. We're seeing it. It seems like it's happening. And there's actually similar dynamics happening in the non-professional content space as well. So in Reddit, Wikipedia, Stack Overflow, users of these platforms are engaging in various forms of collective action that are targeted specifically at AI systems. And then, there's this sort of hypothesized, this was hypothesized back in 2015. And the idea is it's the doom loop, or it's the paradox of reuse, where these platforms, Reddit, Stack Overflow, Wikipedia, are providing existentially important content. And the AI companies that use that content replace them in some manner, right? So instead of going to Stack Overflow to get my coding help, I go to ChatGPT, and now nobody's on Stack Overflow anymore. The platform sort of dies, and then how do you train GPT-5? Where does the data come from? It won't. And so this is a phenomenon that's sort of mutual interest to everybody in the online community space, in the data space. The companies don't want this, the academics don't want this, like nobody really wants this to happen. So here, it's quite concerning. And it also, I should mention, there's some evidence, this is early evidence, but it does seem like some of this is happening now. And so it's actually a little bit urgent, I think, for sort of various online communities to come together and decide what to do about this. So going back here to this question, are data strikes guaranteed? We could imagine sort of successful data strikes that see content producers or that see online communities sort of getting their concessions. The unsuccessful data strike, if they don't succeed in getting any concessions, again, the result might be that the company goes out of business. And arguably some of the economic developments in like the journalism industry are showing patterns of this right now. Of course, it's really hard to do causal inference on like layoff announcements and things like that, but it does seem like there's sort of an urgent need for a new grand bargain in that space. And then same thing could happen with online platforms as well. So like again, it's probably good for both businesses and for society if we can achieve some form of bargaining and not the bargaining breaks down, all the platforms disappear, all of our digital infrastructure degrades, and we're just left with the 2024 version of ChatGPT as our only thing that we interact with for the rest of time, right? Nobody wants that, I don't think. So there is like a nice case study actually from this is a study back in 2017 looking at how Google, sort of imagining a world in which Wikipedia isn't available to Google and how much more valuable is Google search. And so, my colleagues, the authors, did this study where they sort of built a browser extension that would remove Wikipedia links and then ask users to use Google search. And they found that when people didn't have Wikipedia in the results, they didn't like it as much, right? And ultimately, like this, I also did some studies sort of following up on this. And, we can't claim the credit for this, but like ultimately, Google did make large donations to Wikipedia and helped to pay for their infrastructure. And so I think we could see something like this happening with other platforms and with generative AI companies in particular. So I would note that there's there's an open question as to whether we're going to see more deals that focus on the direct use of content. So sort of, licensing if I'm Shutterstock, right? Shutterstock is going to license my set of pictures, or if I'm sort of a collective of authors or artists, I license the written works of the folks in my collective, right? That's like sort of one option. We also could see a more indirect use of content where we're doing sort of, there's a big pool of data out there, and I'm not buying it necessarily from the Nick's author collective, but I'm buying a style. I want to buy, a visual art style or a writing style. And there's some sort of tracking that's trying to attribute that back to the folks who actually created that content in the first place. So these are two sort of offerings that could happen, and I think that what will actually play out in practice will depend a little bit on the economics incentives of the folks who are buying this, which is the AI developers ultimately. So I would also note that there's a lot of lawsuits going on here, but this is not just about law. It's not really just about is this illegal or not. So one lens through which a lot of discussion about the topic is all about copyright. Generative AI and tech companies broadly are violating copyright, and that's the problem. But I would argue that is a part of the discussion for sure. It's not the only problem. So it's a small part of the picture. We could think about a lot of this grand bargain in terms of labor law, contract law, all sorts of various laws. And of course, we have to consider the fact that, a system being operated in Canada will be subject to Canadian federal law. A lot of these companies are located in California, so specific California laws might apply. So this is just one part of the picture, and the actual legal question here is going to be really complicated. It is interesting to note that so far, a lot of the generative AI companies have basically said, you can't scrape the outputs of my language model, despite the fact that the language models are trained on, let's scrape as much of the internet as we basically can. So there's sort of an interesting, issue there, and we'll see how that plays out. I mean, I don't have an answer to this one per se, but I think that it's something to keep on the radar. And this is something that we were sort of writing about back in 2021 actually as well. And there's also there's going to be more transparency around data because people are getting excited about this, and there's a lot of skeletons in the closet of the AI community broadly of sort of using these undocumented data sets. There's sort of a culture of just using giant, massive, mysterious blobs of text data to train models. And, I think this is not going to be a good look for the computing community. So there's an argument as well that we should get ahead of this just to maintain the sort of trust with the public. And also, yeah, there's sort of a risk here that we could see third party, like if we're trying to filter away the content that is going to look like a plagiarism or copyright violation. So if I have my model and my LLM can spit out, a popular book, it can spit out The Lord of the Rings, and I want to hide that fact. So I put in a filter that specifically says, don't give the user the full text of The Lord of the Rings when they ask for it, right? Is that then when you investigate that model, it's going to look really suspicious, and it really looks like I'm doing sort of flagrant plagiarism and copyright infringement as well. So this is a big concern for folks developing in this space. And again, yeah, it's just part of the picture. There is sort of there's a lot of ways to exert leverage that are not lawsuits. And so it kind of remains to be seen as to which will dominate. My view as sort of in the interests of giving as many sort of avenues towards bargaining as possible, I think that doing the policy work in conjunction with the tool building. So for instance, if we're going to build tools that support these kinds of collective action, that those things totally work. They complement each other, and that there's no competition between them in my mind. So I would note that like there is a really serious risk as well, risk/opportunity that a policy change, we could wake up tomorrow and if the way that certain courts, such as the US courts, interpret fair use and large language models, if they announce a decision and say that sort of the current training paradigm actually does violate this law, that this whole house of cards could really come tumbling down. So I think this is a really unusual sort of state for a research field to be in. Just like there's all these folks in computing who are working on LLMs. There's all this venture capital money going into this space, and it's really vulnerable to very sudden change based on this data dependency. The reason that's an opportunity, though, is that, of course, as academics, if we can sort of do work that supports new data policies or sort of build new platforms for supporting collective action and such, that these things can have a really outsized impact. So from the risk, going back to the view of tech companies, right? This is like a marketing risk, but it's also an opportunity. So the more sort of coverage that comes about the data-related issues, the more likelihood that customers are going to be concerned. And of course, some customers are particularly sensitive to these matters. So if Canada, if the BC government or the Canadian federal government is buying sort of computing services and AI services from a Microsoft or a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon, these governments are going to really care about this stuff, right? They don't want to buy products that have these very questionable data supply chains, so to speak. I'll also note that there's this very serious concern of demographic biases in the training content, and to the extent that we view a lot of the practices of collecting this data as a form of intellectual property dispossession, there's probably going to be disparate impacts in that. So there's actually some early evidence. I have work coming out soon with some of my colleagues from the States, looking specifically at the question of whether Jewish Americans are particularly affected by this potential IP dispossession, and our work suggests yes. And probably many other marginalized groups, including in Canada, are likely to be affected by this as well, or that is to say, some groups are more likely to sort of suffer economic harms from language models. And this leads into a very complicated discussion about being overrepresented in training data versus being underrepresented in training data. So there's sort of a long history of work in responsible AI about this topic that I'm not going to get into right now, but I do just think this is a concern to have sort of on the radar as well. Tech companies don't want to see headlines that are suggesting that their new AI system is built on the theft of property. Are they the new Napster? Are they killing the job market? These things, again, this is where assuming that we're all sort of broadly interested in pro-social AI, our incentives are actually quite nicely aligned with tech companies here. So there's sort of risks and opportunities for AI's impact on the world. I'm very concerned about the wealth and power concentration and their downstream effects. And I think that this sort of idea of healthy content supply chains can solve a lot of this. One quick, coming to the end here, but I do just want to talk a little bit about sort of the specific harms that I think we might see and that we can make serious efforts to mitigate. So one is that the idea that AI, and because of this data flow, we're going to see actual changes in the labor share of revenue. So there's a lot of economics work on this topic, and basically there's a concern that a lot of AI relies on just not paying for labor that you would, otherwise pay for, right? So there's an interesting example here of the study of Reddit moderators and their sort of economic impact on Reddit as a corporation, suggesting that they save Reddit quite a bit of money, and that broadly this happens across the computing industry and is probably not good for society. It's probably reasonable to assume that if a technology can do a lot of the work of lawyers, doctors, scientists, academics, creative workers, that's probably going to reduce the labor share of revenue. And if that happens, it's probably quite bad. It's quite societally disruptive. So we probably want to avoid this. There's serious risk of widespread legitimacy crises. And a lot of historical examples of property dispossession, basically having really serious long-lasting effects, and we want the computing community to not do that. So the grand challenge for us is, can we entirely reinvent the LLM, replaced with AI or your favorite data-dependent computing technology of your choice? Broadly, we are united in our interests in supporting a healthy democracy, collective intelligence, et cetera, support a new supply chain. Maybe this means full consent language models. Maybe this means supporting infrastructure for data unions that bargain on behalf of individuals. Maybe it means standing up some sort of data dividends program where we send some of the economic winnings back to data creators to offset economic impacts and raise up the levels of social support for people who are affected, which is basically everyone using the internet. So with that, I will leave it here on this final slide. There's my contact info. I'm also around. I'm over in Task 1 if you ever just want to come by and chat and say hello. Yeah, I think that I'll end there and take questions.